The Honourable David Parker.
That's a member of the Maori plutocracy in favour of dictatorship rather than democracy. I think that's typical of the National Party, isn't it? They really are losing touch when they think that after 6 years without democracy, the answer is still not democracy. I think that sort of says it all of the National Party, increasingly out of touch with what New Zealanders want. And I don't think that this is unusual to New Zealand. Actually, people around the world eventually march in the streets when they're denied their right to control how their lives are run through democracy. And I look around this hall here, and I've heard other people say this before, but all the people that fought in these battles around the world, what were they fighting for? They're actually fighting for democracy, because democracy in the end is what causes societies in the longer term to be prosperous and peaceful, because the sort of accommodations that need to be made between people are made. The environment is actually better protected in democracies around the world than it is in countries that are not democratic. So the aberration that we had in Canterbury, where there were problems with the management of resources, including water resources, justified only the shortest of interventions. I do agree that there were problems with Environment Canterbury. I also agree with Eugenie Sage that the problems were less serious by the time they actually put in commissions than they had been earlier. The earlier Regional Council had been quite remiss in not having a water plan for the management of their resources. It is also true that the Council was pressured with this huge change in technology and economics of irrigation that meant there was a real push towards intensive land practices that were polluting the waterways. But the sadness is, 8 years on, from this government saying that they were going to fix this sort of thing, including through their intervention in Environment Canterbury and also through national policy statements, water quality in Canterbury is still getting worse. It's a terrible thing. About 2 months ago, I was fishing in the back blocks of Canterbury in a pristine river. I was with a fishing guide who a friend of mine was using, and he used to until about 2 years ago, regularly take visitors to the mid and south Canterbury rivers and the lowland rivers like the Opahi. He no longer does. Given up on that completely because they're too dirty to fish. Sucked dry, the water that's left in them is dirty. And we've seen those photographs recently. Well, those things have got worse under the National Government, and they continue to get worse because they haven't grasped the nettle that needs to be grasped and made increases in intensity and land use, which is what is the cause of most pollution now. More intensive land practice, more irrigation, a higher cost system, you need to have more output, therefore you need more livestock per hectare, you need more fertiliser, therefore you have more nutrient runoff and livestock effluent getting into our rivers. It's that simple. And the only way you can stop that is by having rules that say increases in land use intensity are no longer a permitted activity, because they've got to be controlled in some ways so that our waterways don't get dirty. And the government still hasn't done that, and actually, with due respect to the commissioners in Canterbury, they haven't done that either. Maybe elected ones would. Mr. Speaker, the other thing that this extension of this legislation does, so that there'll be 9 years without full democracy in this region, is it overrules conservation orders and conservation orders that were in process. The Huranui River Water Conservation Order application had been made. It was going to eventually go to the Environment Court. The Environment Court have over the years in New Zealand made very wise decisions in respect of conservation orders so that at least some of our rivers have been protected from damming and have appropriate minimum environmental flows, and sometimes, not often, but sometimes some decent controls on water quality. They cut across that. They were clear that one of the reasons they were imposing these commissioners was to cut across it, because otherwise they wouldn't have put these specific rules in the legislation about conservation orders. They would have just put commissioners in there and left the other laws intact. They cut across it because they're not even willing to actually allow, in the face of this enormous pressure on Canterbury rivers, there to be exploration in court as to whether there should have been a conservation order on the Huranui River. And they pretend to be in favour of improving our water quality. They say they're in favour of water quality, and what's their minimum standard? Wadeability. Wadeability. You can walk through it, but you can't put your head under. They have all of these weird excuses from Nick Smith saying, oh, well, that's, rivers in flood, can't be swum in. Well, they can't be waded in either. They don't even make the wadeability standard. And no one's ever suggesting that that minimum standard apply to rivers that are in flood. The next excuse that we had from him was, well, look, some rivers are naturally dirty sometimes. Sometimes there's a lot of birds nesting on the bank. That was one of the examples he used. Seagulls on the bank of the Ashburton River. No one's suggesting that natural causes of degradation river can be regulated away. We're just saying human intervention ought to not to be allowed to take clean rivers down to dirty rivers to below a swimmability standard. In truth, the objective of this government, and it comes up every national government that we've had in recent decades, is they've got this two-class mentality for rivers. They are willing to protect a few rivers. They are generally large rivers that rise in national parks, and they're so big it's very difficult to put so much pollution in them, they get dirty anyway. And the rest of the rivers, the small rivers, particularly the lowland rivers, well, they let them be polluted. They turn them into drains, and that's what they've done in Canterbury, and they've stopped it being. Now, I'm going to hear Sarah Dowie, get up next and defend and she'll say what she said in respect of her last speech, which is, in Southland, there's all these wonderfully protected rivers. It's not true. It's not true. I was counsel for the conservation orders on the rivers that have conservation orders in Southland. The Mataura River, I regret that when I was counsel in those applications, because water quality was not a pressing issue, we did not get decent water quality minimum standards in those conservation orders. We got flow protection because the big threat generally was to flow. It wasn't as to quality. Since then, rivers like the Mataura have become filthy. Filthy. Worse than they used to be. I have people report to me that they come down, they walk across tributaries and drains that lead into the Mataura River, and they are full of what comes out the end of a cow. Excrement, that's right. I was going to use a shorter word. Mr. Speaker, there are complex problems behind rising pressure on waterways. It has been driven by a change in profitability of different farming types. Rising commodity prices meant that increasingly intensive and expensive farming systems became economic. More irrigation could be supported, more fertiliser, more livestock. That's one of the problems. And regulation hasn't caught up with it. Mr. Speaker, one of the other pressures has been changes in technology that wasn't there 20 or 30 years ago. K-line irrigation, enabling irrigation of rolling country. Mr. Speaker, we've had other causes like, we've run out of land to develop. We used to break in land that had never been farmed. We've done all that now, and therefore, if you want to increase output, you've got to further develop the land that's already been developed, and therefore you've got more pressure on waterways. All of these factors are playing a part, but the sad truth is, 8 years after this government came in, having killed the Judge Shepherd National Policy Statement, which would have controlled increases in land use intensity and stopped our clean rivers getting dirty, the national government's allowed it to get worse. They say, to me, the most important river is the local river that I want to swim in. I think that's true for most people. And if their local river is clean and my local river is clean, all our local rivers will be clean and all our rivers will be swimmable. We're a long way off that. It's going to take a generation to get back to that. But one of the ways you get back that is to listen to the voice of the people. Canterbury people are sick of their rivers being polluted. They want democracy. I pay credit to the existing commissioners. They have improved the plan. They've taken out a lot of the irrelevancies. They've made some progress in Canterbury rivers, but now, 6 years after they were appointed, it is time to go back to full democracy. I oppose this bill.
Sarah